Okay, so this is going to be a video where I'm pretty much going to be kind of justifying myself if I should upgrade to the Sony A7S III or not. And I'm a hybrid shooter, and so I do both photography and videography as a living. So we're going to kind of go over the specs and if it's really worth upgrading or not. And from what I've seen, I mean, this camera looks amazing. I'm just going over the B&H page right now, and the specs for this camera is amazing. But one thing I will say is that if you're a professional photographer, I honestly wouldn't recommend this camera. I know a lot of people like to get the A7 cameras to do like super low light photography, like if they're shooting the stars or whatever, but it doesn't really give you much of a low light advantage compared to the other cameras. The images do look cleaner than their higher megapixel cameras like the A7R cameras, and that's just because it's a lower resolution picture. If you were to take the A7R4's like 65 megapixel images and you compress it down to 12 megapixel, you would get about the same noise. So for photography, I wouldn't recommend this camera, but for videography, this is a pretty amazing camera. So going over the spec sheet, first of all, 12.1 megapixel, which for photography, again, it's not that great. I wouldn't say it's terrible, but for photography, I would recommend at least like 20 to 24 megapixels. I think that's a good range. And then if you have extra money, then you can get like the A7R4 or the R3 that are 42 megapixels or 65 megapixels. And that's what I'm shooting with right now, actually. I'm shooting with the A7R3 that has 42 megapixels, which is great for cropping. If you're shooting someone's face with it, or pretty much, especially if you're just working with female models, you do have to do extra work into processing those images so that you don't see every detail on a person's face. If you're shooting product or something, those details it can help. Sometimes it cannot. Like sometimes if you're shooting a product and you're using a high resolution photography camera, then you're gonna see like the smudges or like dust on the object that you're shooting. So it does make you do a little extra work, but it's not too bad. So just for cropping purposes, I would recommend getting a higher megapixel camera. But besides that, let's just go over the video specs, which I done before, but let's compare it to the older cameras, which is that, this camera does 4K 120p video, 10-bit 422 internally. Now that is amazing, like I mentioned before in other videos, I personally don't like shooting 4K that much, but there are some jobs that require it, If I ever shoot for like a TV pilot or any movies or whatever, if you're a B or C cam for that, you do have to be shooting in 4K nowadays, You can't really get away with 1080p, especially how, Netflix or Amazon Prime is, they do require you to have 4K footage for them. So personally, having these higher frame rate resolutions for 4K, I am happy about. And since this camera is 12.1 megapixels, you do get one by one pixel readout, which means that the camera doesn't have to do extra work trying to process the images, and you're gonna get less noise because of that. But also, this camera does do 10-bit 1080p, which I've been asking for the longest time. If you just compare this camera to the Sony FS5, which shoots 1080p 10-bit, there's a huge difference. And as someone that likes shooting in 1080p, shooting between this camera and the FS5 makes a huge difference. So I'm happy that this camera also does 10-bit 1080p, which I'm happy about. And it even like shoots up to like, qualities of like 600 megabits per second, which is amazing. And I'm sure this camera will do a way better video than the FS5, which I already own. So this camera can also shoot at 120 FPS in 4K, which is pretty amazing. And the funny thing is that the FS5 could actually do it too if you get an external recorder for it. It can do 4K 124 FPS RAW, but from the footage I've seen, it's never looked that good, and I'm sure the 4K out of this will look better just because it's a newer camera. But that's amazing, and it can do 1080p up to 248 frames, which is also pretty great. But I will have to say, for some reason, after FS5, they kind of gave up on like the high-speed modes, because FS5 can shoot up to 960 FPS in 1080p, because I'm putting the codes because it's a way lower resolution, but still interprets it as 1080p. But after that, they kind of just gave up on that. Like if you get an FS7 or FS9, they only shoot up to like 120 or 240 in 1080p. So for some reason, only FS9 can do up to 960 FPS. But again, this is pretty amazing, and I'm sure the video quality will just be a lot better because it can shoot up to 600 megabits per second. So that's amazing. And this camera can actually shoot at S-Log3, which the FS5 and the A7 III cameras can do it also, but because of the limitations of the bit rates in those cameras, it never looked good. That's why I always use S-Log2 for those cameras, but for this camera, S-Log3 will look just amazing. So that's one reason, like for videos, this camera is just gonna look a lot better when it comes to, so this camera is just gonna look a lot better if you're upgrading from these other cameras, the FS5 or the A7 cameras. But again, you have to ask yourself, is the difference gonna be worth it? And for now, I mean, the videos you can shoot with those cameras look amazing. If it looked just a little bit better, is it gonna be worth you spending, you know, thousands of dollars on this camera? And how much is this camera? This camera is $3,498. So that's a lot of money, you know, but it might be worth it. And if you were looking for a B cam, or maybe even if you have an A7 III but you want a second camera, if you get this camera, then you can use your A7 III as your B cam. You know, it might be worth doing. And you know, it's gonna have a fast hybrid autofocus system. I don't know if it's gonna be better, but the A7R3 that I'm shooting with has an amazing autofocus. So I'm sure if it's a little better than that, you know, either way, it's gonna be amazing. But the thing is that the FS5 has horrible autofocus. You know, I made 2 previous videos on those cameras, and I always been disappointed with the autofocus on that camera. So having a cam that has pretty good autofocus will help you depending on what kind of shoots you do. If you're in a professional shoot, you're probably gonna be using manual focus if you're behind the camera. But in scenarios like this video right here, where you have to be in front of the camera, having autofocus is a huge lifesaver. Now this camera has 5-axis steady shot image stabilization, and I believe it's the same one from their current cameras, which is kind of terrible. But now they have a digital image stabilization also that uses gyroscopes. So that I heard is pretty good. So that's something I'm very excited about because I hate using gimbals. So if this camera can give you great image stabilization just out of the camera, you know, that would be great. And that way you don't have to, you know, bring this heavy gimbal with you that you have to like spend an hour setting up. You know, I just hate using them. So that's pretty great. And it's gonna have the same body as the A7R4, which I heard is better because I'm not a huge fan of the A7R3's body. I pretty much never use that camera without a grip because it's just way too small. And there's advantages to having a smaller camera, but just for, you know, holding it, you know, it's just not comfortable. And if it's not a comfortable camera, then your camera's just gonna shake, and that's gonna, you know, make the pretty bad image stabilization in the camera even worse. So having a more comfortable camera body is very important. Now this one's pretty huge because they redesigned the whole menu, which if you ever use a Sony camera, they have the worst menu systems ever, and they actually completely changed it, and you can now use the touchscreen to, you know, do everything. But things that I wish they would just, you know, update these older cameras like the A7R3 that I'm shooting with right now to have the same menus, because that's just a firm update. They can just do that with, you know, any camera that has a touchscreen that they already sold, but they're probably not gonna say that you would buy the newer camera. But again, that's pretty great. And finally, this camera has a tiltable LCD screen that you can, you know, move to the side and then you can see yourself, which is huge for video. For photography, I actually prefer the older style. But again, this is a video-centric camera, so honestly, that's pretty amazing. And that's gonna be very useful. Because like for shooting this video right now, I'm actually just, you know, using my phone to like see myself. But again, if I had the LCD camera, that I can just turn that around and be able to see myself, so I can, you know, frame everything properly. And also, if you're behind the camera, you can like just show the LCD screen to the talent you're shooting, just so they can see their frame and everything. So that's very important, and I'm happy they're doing it. They have a full-size HDMI port. Again, that's pretty huge because those micro HDMI ports constantly break. You know, if you just like, even if you're gentle with it, just like someone bumps into it or whatever, it will break easily, you know. I rarely ever used mine, and when I did, I broke it. So again, that's pretty huge. And that's pretty much it. And now the question is it worth upgrading? And now, you know, the main feature of the A7S cameras is the low light capability. Now, like I said, the video quality will improve, but when it comes to low light, that's where this camera is really gonna shine. So if you're someone like a wedding videographer, definitely a buy, Personally, I don't shoot weddings, but I also do videos for like bars or restaurants. And in those scenarios, you rarely ever have any lighting to work with. Restaurants and bars are usually very dimly lit. For those scenarios, this camera is just going to be amazing, which is one of the main reasons I kind of want to get this camera. But again, I don't really do it that much, so I don't know if it's really justified for doing it. And there's no overheating, so if you're someone like an A7S2 camera owner, a lot of those people complain about the overheating of the camera, and if you're an A7S2 owner and you love that camera, it's probably worth upgrading now, and you can always use your A7S2 as a B cam now, and you can use the A7S3 as the A cam. So for stuff like that, I think it's great. And if you're someone who has an even older camera, like an A7 II or A7R2, one of the main problems with those cameras is the battery. The batteries will die out immediately, and this camera, it does use the newer batteries that are, I think it was introduced with the A7 III cameras, which I love. I even have a battery crib of it, so I have 2 of those batteries in there, and I pretty much just use my camera for like days, without having to have it charge it, and I just like plug it into USB-C port on it and then just charge it from there. It's amazing. But other than that, if you're someone that just shoots but other than that, if you're upgrading from the FS5, it's a little bit more complicated, I think, because you will definitely get better image quality out of this camera. It's not like the A7 III or A7R3 where, you still get better video features from the FS5, but A7R3 has like, better autofocus, and it's just smaller, so it's lighter. But now if you're upgrading from the FS5, it gets a little bit more complicated because, when it comes to shooting corporate videos, having those XLR ports are very important to me because you can just plug into XLR port, you get phantom power from there, you get your audio in the video, you can just shoot forever on there. And the cool thing about this camera is that this camera can shoot more than 30 minutes, which is huge if you're doing any professional work, because you're gonna get jobs that will be like shooting a conference or a wedding ceremony where you're gonna have to shoot more than 30 minutes. For those scenarios, this camera is amazing. I think you would be better off just saving your money and getting an FS9, which is an amazing camera also. And that camera will also complement this camera. But FS9 is like a $10,000 camera, so there is a big difference. But again, from FS5, I don't think you really need to upgrade to this camera. But you will get better video quality. So if that's something you haven't been happy with the FS5, then maybe you should check out this camera. But anyways guys, that's gonna be it for this video. If you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe to my channel, and in the future I probably eventually will end up getting this camera, so we'll make more videos on it once we get our hands on it. But I'll see you guys in the next video. I make videos every single week, so I'll see you then. Goodbye.